I feel like for me, there's not that many places I could live in the world that are so in line with my values. We're just an unusual place, and I feel blessed that I have found that place, and I feel like my life is much more values driven than many, many, many other choices I could have made in my life, and I'm grateful for that. So I was living in Montreal. I was a sort of a, alternative urban student activist type of person. And somehow, I wish I could remember the very first moment that the words Twin Oaks sort of reverberated against my eardrum, but I can't remember. But a friend of mine, her sister had lived in another community in Ontario called Dandelion, which I knew was somehow associated with Twin Oaks in Virginia. And so I went down on this road trip in the US, and at the end of the road trip, my friends were ready to go home, and I had 3 weeks before I was ready to go home, and it turned out to be the magic 3 weeks for the 3-week visitor period. And I came and did it, and I wasn't thinking I was going to move here. It was in a foreign country, for one thing, in a different country, and I was just, taking time out to travel and see what I might do next in the world. But once I got here and spent 3 weeks here, I sort of feel like I was swept off my feet by the community. And I realized that I could make this a choice of where I would live. And for me, it was a matter of, I carried around with me in my mind sort of my perfect world, if I could design what life would look like. And Twin Oaks was the first place I'd found that most closely matched my internal values vision. And I was free in life, and I thought this would be a good move for myself in life. And that was 17 years ago. I would say that when I moved here in my mid-20s, the values I was looking for, I was very oriented towards a feminist perspective on the world at that time, which incorporates a lot of other things. Really, egalitarianism is a very basic part of many feminisms, and my feminism, you might say. So that was a big piece of it for me. When I moved here, there was a feminist study group, and 25% of the women who lived here were lesbian. That's pretty phenomenal. So that was a piece of it for sure. Also, sustainability, doing things on a scale that made sense, that you could do forward into the future in a scale that made sense. That was a piece of it for me. Nonviolence, I feel like that almost goes without saying, but it doesn't in this world today. So that was a piece of it for me. And really, I think just how it felt. It felt comfortable. I was raised in the suburbs, and from a very young age, not even on a conscious level, but it was very clear to me that is not the cloth from which I was cut. And I knew that's not what I was going to do with my life. I didn't know what it was going to be. And I think when I set foot at Twin Oaks, again, my sort of half-conscious mind got an idea that this might be what it is. When I think about being a person who wants to affect change in the world, in a way I tend to see two paths that one could choose. And one is that of resisting and struggling against the dominant paradigm, making changes within the system. The other is creating an alternative to that dominant paradigm. And for me, I think both of those paths are important. They both are needed. I'm glad they're both happening in the world. And from the early on, for me, it's been very clear where my heart has been drawn, much more towards creating change, making an alternative possibility a reality. And for me, it's a lot about having not the working against energy, but the working for energy. And that, I feel, Twin Oaks is a really good place where I can put that energy to work in the world. I also wanted to talk about, when I think about Twin Oaks, sort of as compared to Twin Oaks culture compared to mainstream culture, I think that many of us and people who come here, new members who arrive, they've looked around at the mainstream and found something lacking. That's not what they're looking for, and they want to find something else according to their values. And I think of it in a way like, it's not like people look at the mainstream and we feel like, I want a bigger piece of the pie. It's that we want a different pie. And I feel like that's what we're doing at Twin Oaks, is we're creating that other reality. For a time, there was this sort of slogan in the activist movement of another world is possible. And for us, another world is happening, and we're living it. And that's an important thing for us. We want to let other people know about that. We want them to come join us. This is not for everyone, but many people find themselves drawn to this way of life. You can edit my eye roll. And the other thing I wanted to say, kind of in a more general system, is looking at Twin Oaks culture and living compared to mainstream culture and living, sort of as all of us as humans go through life, our different stages of life, in the mainstream so often each different stage happens in a separate location and very dislocated from other parts of our life. So often we're born in a hospital, we're educated in a school, we work for a business, we have our home, domestic life. When we die, we're buried on land that a company owns for that purpose. It's sort of all very disjointed from each other part. And at Twin Oaks, the way we live our lives, we're essentially a modern-day rural village of 100 people, and all those life stages do happen here. We had a baby born last week at Twin Oaks, so we're born here, we educate our children here, our work is integrated into our daily lives, we have collectively owned businesses that we have on the land, our home lives and relationship lives are here, and if we stay long enough, when we die, we're buried in our graveyard here. And so it's this sort of cradle-to-grave experience that I feel like the key difference for me of how we do it and how the mainstream does it is here, we're the ones making decisions about how all of those different aspects are going to look. In the mainstream, you're somewhat at the whim of what the hospital, what the school, what the job, what those people's values are, and you try to fit yourself in and around them. At Twin Oaks, nobody's creating these values and these structures but us. So we have a very high degree of choice, and we can consciously manifest our own values in the world throughout all stages of life. One area of sustainability that I feel Twin Oaks is very strong in is food and food production. We have our own farm, we have our own garden here on our land. We raise cows and chickens, so in our dairy and meat, we're pretty much 95% self-sufficient. We do occasionally buy bacon for Sunday brunch or something like that. We also have a 2.5-acre organic vegetable garden, and I believe it's a 3,000 square foot, quite large greenhouse. And we have, 25 or 30 members on our garden crew working, of course, more in the summer, but all year round, in fact, growing our own food. As I said, it's all organic, so that, again, sort of sidesteps the whole question of pesticides and, negative impact on the earth in that way. But I think more importantly, or perhaps more importantly, is that we're not having to truck in and ship in. Even if we were buying organic everything from Whole Foods, it's coming from New Zealand and from California, and we just don't have to deal with that at all. The food we eat from earth to mouth, it just gets pulled by a cart 200 yards up the hill to our dining hall from the garden, and you can't get much more locally and sustainably grown than that. Another benefit to living so collectively as we do is in terms of transportation and sustainability. So the way Twin Oaks works, nobody here has a private vehicle because we're communal and collective. The community owns 18 vehicles for about 100 people who live here. And so what that means is 18 vehicles for 100 people is much, much less than the national average of how many cars there are. So just on that level, we're having a lot less impact. We also have a system where we can organize our shopping together. So say, this is the way it is. On a given day, probably 15 to 20 people need something in town. And so instead of 15 or 20 people taking, 15 cars, driving 15 hours individually, and then coming home with what they need, we have a system in which you can just put in a request. One person takes one car, they drive their 1 hour to town, do everybody's shopping all together, drive home, and you've waited, half a day or the next day, and here your item is delivered to you, and you don't even have to, leave the farm. And this is just a huge impact on, carbon emissions and all that kind of stuff. And why we're able to do that is because the scale on which we live, 100 people, we're big enough that we can do that. It makes that big a difference, and we're choosing to use that scale effectively. We could have 100 people and just do the same thing, but because we're choosing consciously a communally driven lifestyle, we're able to reduce our impact on the earth. Again, this is one example of how we're able to do that with vehicles.